described debate, and I'm sure that many people want to speak. Florence Eshelome.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable friend for that intervention and to wish him a happy birthday. And I'm sure a birthday present would be to get the regulation of managing agents for his constituents. And we have to be honest that self-regulation does not work when there's no real enforcement. And leaseholders are clear with us that they do not just want mandatory qualifications. As Lord Best put in his evidence to us, being qualified doesn't necessarily make people behave properly, but you still need a code of practice and enforcement. So what we need, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a regulator with teeth, one which will issue meaningful sanctions against agents that treat homeowners like a revenue stream. And for the worst offenders, that should include the removal of their licence to operate. I should acknowledge that our inquiry heard from some campaigners who were concerned that regulation could add to the cost passed on to leaseholders via service charges. But on balance, we think that regulation is now necessary to protect all leaseholders from rogue managing agents. The reality is some leaseholders will not be able to convert to Commonhold. Some blocks will not be able to meet the 50% threshold to convert. And some blocks will have special features which mean that they are not eligible. We cannot leave those homeowners behind. Ultimately, Commonhold is a vast improvement, but it won't always be as simple as hiring and firing agents. Commonholds are likely to appoint managing agents on contracts that last for several years. Commonhold needs to have the confidence that they are appointing high-quality service providers. An independent code of practice would provide that assurance. So overall, we think that this is a valuable addition to the final bill, one which would benefit homeowners and homeowners who want to crack down on poor-performing agents like Firstport when the regulator has the teeth to deliver this. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, very quickly.
Thank you, for giving way. And she has mentioned a number of times that nobody should be left behind by this legislation. My constituents suffer from the actions of the St Mary Magdalene and Holy Jesus Trust, a charity which refuses, supposed charity, which refuses to allow them to extend their leases and which is subject to a loophole in the current legislation, so leaving them, as one put it, as prisoners in their current homes. Does she agree with me that this legislation should address the concerns and liberate my constituents?
I thank my honourable friend for making that important point, and the issue of marriage values and the extension of leases and many people having to take out additional loans just to remortgage and extend their lease. This is all the areas covered in this draft bill, and I know that this is something that the Minister is keen to address as well. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill will be an opportunity to impact the lives of millions of constituents across England and Wales who bought their homes in good faith. All of us must take responsibility for keeping this topic on the agenda and for ensuring that this final bill is brought back here and to make progress through Parliament in the autumn. We cannot allow this issue to be swept away by events happening outside of this place or beyond our control. Our report sets out the blueprint for changes needed to make this bolder, more ambitious piece of legislation. With an independent regulator, we can all ensure that homeowners will see real change in the short term. I therefore urge members across the House to support today's motion. Leaseholders' expectations have been set very high, so it is vital we get these reforms right. If we do this, this will be the Parliament that finally makes leaseholders true homeowners with the control that they've been promised and that dream of home ownership.
The question is as on the order paper, and we'll start with an immediate 4-minute time limit. Robbie Moore.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I congratulate the member for Vauxhall and Camberwell Green for her opening remarks and the work of her committee that she has done in producing her report. It was an exceptional read, so I do thank her and her committee for that. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am seeing increasing cases where leaseholders experience a range of problems, including high service and administration charges, a complete range of lack of transparency, of overcharging, charging disproportionate costs to extend leases or to buy freehold, poor actions by managing agents, a slow and costly sales process, and an imbalanced dispute mechanisms with the potential to become liable for the freeholders' legal costs. Nowhere is this more apparent in the retirement village in my constituency up in Ben Ridding. For the past year, I've been working with the Clevedon owners group in my constituency who have experienced real-life examples of how current leasehold framework governing the integrated retirement sector falls well short of the standard that should be expected. The Clevedon owners group is made up of a group of leaseholders at the Audley Clevedon retirement village in Ben Ridding. They have experienced repeated failures by their landlord to fulfil some of the most fundamental obligations contained within their leases, while they continue to collect substantial service charges. Madam Deputy Speaker, this group have estimated that the Audley group collects approximately £30 million worth of annual service charges per year across their whole estate, with £3.5 million of deferred service charges, and yet their residences are falling into disrepair, and the freehold owner is not updating their commitments and indeed undertaking their responsibilities. They have highlighted to me that their biggest concern is around the legal definition of the service charge. Crucially, whether they maintain mandatory payments in retirement leases fall within the statutory definition of the service charge under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985. The experiences of the residents in the Audley retirement village demonstrates exactly why this seemingly technical issue has profound and real consequences. Leaseholders have paid substantial monthly management charges and deferred management charges on the understanding that these funds would maintain their homes, safeguard communal facilities and ensure the long-term sustainability of their residential community. But it is clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, from the meetings that I have had with my constituents that that just simply is not the case. Instead, their properties have gone unserviced, which represents serious questions about how the annual service charge and those funds are being used. Following years of expansion, heavily borrowing and financial difficulties, maintenance across the Audley Clevedon villages reportedly declined significantly, despite leaseholders continuing to pay the increased levels of service provision. That needs to change, and I respect some of the recommendations that have been put in the report on this point. So I would like to say to the Minister and ask the Minister whether he has any intention on commissioning an independent forensic audit of major retirement community operators that would examine corporate governance, financial arrangements, service charge accounting, deferred management charges and compliance with lease obligations. And I'd also like to ask the Minister whether he would confirm that leaseholders in retirement housing, including integrated retirement communities, will not be excluded from the protections of the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act. The current legal framework has failed to keep pace with increasingly complex corporate structures. If confidence in retirement housing is to be restored, residents must be given the protection, transparency and accountability that they rightly expect.
Andrew Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Trust in politics is at an all-time low, and I believe part of the reason for this is that our society is littered with examples of structural unfairness, of injustice, and of ordinary people being ever so slightly fleeced. And the housing market of recent years is a strong case in point. Multiplying ground rents, abuse of the forfeiture system, opaque service charges, management companies that can't be changed, overpriced maintenance performed by firms connected to the management company, no adoption of common assets, short leases, exorbitant lease extension fees. Madam Deputy Speaker, the list goes on. It has been a privilege to have played my part in scrutinising the draft bill because it represents an opportunity to put a significant dent into some of these practices and to demonstrate that politics and politicians can deliver for people and can change lives for the better. As my honourable friend has set out, the committee took evidence from an extensive array of witnesses on the measures in this bill, and I'd like to place on record my thanks to them for their contributions. There are a few points from our report that I'd like to draw out specifically. Firstly, the reinvigoration of Commonhold that this bill will deliver has rightly, in my view, been described not just as an alternative to leasehold, but a radical improvement on it. For it to be implemented successfully, considerable work needs to be undertaken at the Land Registry to make sure that they are ready to respond, not just to the registration of new Commonholds, but to conversion of existing leases. Our committee found that a failure to modernise the Land Registry's legacy systems would pose a significant risk to Commonhold working, and good quality public access systems will be crucial. Second point I wanted to cover was on the ground rent cap, and it's fair to say that this is where the committee spent quite a lot of our time attempting to get to the bottom of the government's rationale for its proposals. I support the proposal to adopt a flat cap of £250 rather than as a percentage of property value. However, I've struggled to understand the rationale behind waiting 40 years before converting to a peppercorn rent. I can understand the desire to give certainty, predictability to investors, and I can understand an argument that investors need time to adapt to changes like this. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, the last 3 successive governments were elected on a mandate to address onerous ground rents. The ground rent system, as my honourable friend said, was condemned by the Competition and Markets Authority when they said they could not find any persuasive evidence that it was commercially necessary or that consumers received anything in return. It should not be a surprise to anyone that the days of ground rent were numbered, and I cannot think of a single other example where a government has been so generous as to provide 40 years' notice of a change in the terms of business. Governments haven't taken this view with students on Plan 2 loans, for example, nor those affected by the rising pension age. The previous government thought 20 years was sufficient, and I'm minded to agree with them unless the department can bring forward more evidence on their rationale. The final point I wanted to make was on the absence of regulation of property management agents from this bill. Now, everyone in this House knows that this is a change that is long overdue, and we have Lord Best in the public gallery today. We have his excellent 2019 report, which set out the case very clearly, alongside the work undertaken by my honourable friend, the member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip, on his private member's bill. Now, I understand the concern about the size of the Commonhold and Leasehold Reform Bill as it is, and that adding these measures will create further delay. All I would say in response is that we have both the opportunity and the responsibility to act. No time has been set aside in the King's speech for a separate regulation of property agents bill, so I hope that the Minister will seize the opportunity in front of him and chip away at another practice that blights the lives of our constituents and undermines trust in institutions to deliver for them. Thank you.
Will Foster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Leasehold is a con. We are one of the few countries in England that still has residential leasehold, and because of that, people are being sold a lie on home ownership. As Woking's MP, I hear countless stories about it, and I won't use my time to go through every single one of them, but I impress on the government this: we need to regulate these bureaucratic con artists. People have been scammed out of home ownership in place of leasehold. It's Fleecehold. Dreams of home ownership have stayed dreams, far out of reach and fast becoming a nightmare. We hear far too often of leaseholders who have been distressed by a poor service. These bad actors lie behind paperwork and avoid responsibility. Major firms, such as Firstport, have for far too long been allowed to deliver appalling levels of service without consequence. The new Leasehold Reform Bill must put in place a regulator with the teeth to sanction these rogue agents with meaningful penalties. When this happens, MPs can end the Wild West of property management agents. If we want to look at why leasehold reform is so urgent, we only need to look at managing agents like Firstport and how they treat leaseholders. I had a situation of a retirement development in Woking where this area should be a lovely place to live, it should be a peace of mind for these vulnerable elderly residents, but people fell over. The safety systems that Firstport put in place didn't work. Elderly residents were left lying on the floor having called for help. Firstport should have fixed it, and they didn't. Sometimes people have been left in those distressing situations, and because of that lack of regulation, we can't hold those that are responsible accountable. Firstport also managed the Clock Tower building in Maybury. They have spent years causing misery to leaseholders, misery through a failure to deliver minimum levels of service, and people are trapped. People are absolutely trapped, which is why I've written to the Minister on numerous occasions about that case. Leaseholders have little rights and are not able to sell their homes or have the control of what they're able to manage. The leaseholders of Bramwell Place, another development in Woking, know this all too well and are trapped in their homes due to frequent stalling and lack of communication. The developer completed the necessary fire safety investigations a year ago, but refused to release critical reports, burying them in internal review. Now the lenders have denied the people in those homes mortgages, buyers are walking away, and innocent residents are left struggling. I sit on the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee, and I've been proud to work on this report that pushes the government to go further and faster than what they're doing. And I want to thank the Honourable Lady for Vauxhall and Camberwell Green for her leadership and the excellent support of our committee clerks. I do hope the government listens to our cross-party calls today. We recommended significant changes to the Leasehold Bill. It's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't deliver what we want. It's mind-boggling that the bill doesn't deliver on the promises in the Labour manifesto. That's why we recommended the bill delivers that independent regulator to end that wild west of property management agents. If we do this, First Port and others will not get away with that appalling treatment that my constituents and others face. To conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's heartbreaking that so many people in Woking and across the country have worked hard to get on the property ladder, but have seen their home ownership dream turn into a nightmare. Successive governments have failed to tackle this, whether it's on ground rents, leasehold reform, and we want to put homeowners in control of the management of their buildings. So I urge the Minister today to agree to implement the full Select Committee report in full, and let's leave a lasting legacy on leasehold reform. Thank you.
John MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Just briefly, I want to get on the record what's happening in my constituency, because I explained to my constituents I would. Very, very briefly, what's happened is with the expansion of Heathrow Airport, land prices have gone up, manufacturers have moved out into cheaper areas, often with grants, and we've had the manufacturing areas replaced with large numbers of flats. I'd normally welcome that, but actually the prices of those flats are prohibitive in terms of local people. But large numbers of young people, bless them, have done everything they possibly can to raise the 300,000 or 350,000 to buy one of those smaller flats. And they've welcomed it, a new home, and we welcomed it into the community. And then, like many others, we're now getting a flood of constituents coming to see us because the increase in service charges has pushed them over the edge. And if we look at the surveys that have gone on and explain to in heartfelt terms, some young people have said, we've not had a family because we can't afford a family. And then some of them have tried to sell on, but some of them have had grants to get their flat, and they have to pay it back. So they're caught in a catch-22 situation. And then they come to me and say, here are the service charges, and this is what we get. And the service levels are appalling, absolutely appalling. And we've had numerous examples. And I understand the call for regulations and regulator, and I agree, but I think the best form of regulation is to give ownership properly to those people who are living in those properties. And that's why I want a simple message from me is to the government is please deliver, like we've said it, please deliver the Law Commission's remaining recommendations on the enfranchising right to manage. One of the issues as well that has come up time and time again, my honourable friend from the constituency, I can't remember now, exactly, has been campaigning on this since the early 2000s, and it's about developmental value, which actually I think is a ludicrous proposition that somehow you have to pay up front for development value, that a development that might never happen and become costed by the freeholder. And again, it's preventing the opportunity for people to either buy or sell on. And again, I think it's a key recommendation that's come out from the Law Commission time and time again. I urge the government to do it. Can I also say the issue that my honourable friend has raised about the threshold for participation set at 50%? In other areas, that doesn't apply. On tenant management organisations, it's 20%. In the employment rights legislation, we're now removing those onerous criteria because it prevents participation. And in areas like mine, a lot of those properties are owned by often overseas landlords as well, and it's very difficult getting them to participate in any form of thing. So the request to move the threshold to 35%, I think, is ultimately reasonable and is manageable in that sense. And I have to say, I agree with my honourable friend, 40 years on ground rate, come on. We'd have the waspy women banging at our door soon, won't we? There's no area I've known where 40 years has been a notification period. The recommendation is to get it down to 20 years. I'd get rid of them now. I really would, because I think it is wealth extraction for no service whatsoever. Finally, I just say in terms of the government's proposals about ensuring that we can ensure lease extensions and freehold acquisitions are cheaper overall, I think is one that I think ultimately will benefit a large number of our constituents, but need to be implemented as rapidly as possible. That's why I welcome this bill, and I hope that with the new regime, let's call it that way, we can get this legislation through as fast as possible.
Dr Al Pinkerton.
Thank you. I thank the honourable member, the committee chair, for securing this important debate today. I want to use the brief time I have just to share 2 examples from my constituency of systemic mismanagement in managed property. The first example that I want to cite is a First Port managed property. We've heard their name mentioned already. It's called Bentley Court in Camberley's town centre. And on the 19th of March this year, the building's only lift broke down. And for most of us, that would be a frustration. But for the retirement community who live in that building, it has been life-changing. These are older people, very often with significant mobility issues. That lift isn't just a convenience, it's their access point to and from their property. It is their independence. Residents tell me that they haven't been able to go shopping, they've missed hospital appointments, some can't take their rubbish out, others have become trapped in their homes for days at a time, which brings me to the case of Audrey West, one of my constituents. She has lived at Bentley Court for more than 26 years. She suffers from heart failure, COPD, chronic bronchitis, and has serious mobility problems. She became a prisoner in her own home weeks ago when that lift broke down. Her health and well-being have deteriorated. When she attempted to tackle the stairs, the physical exertion caused enormous strain on her body, leaving her breathless and exhausted. That's only been compounded by the recent heatwave. In order to secure their mother's safety, her family concluded that the only thing they could do was to remove her from her home of 26 years. And then on the 28th of June, just days after leaving her home, Audrey's family contacted First Port again, copying in my office, to inform them and me that Audrey had died. Now, I'm not here to claim that a broken lift has directly caused Audrey's death, but I am willing to say this, that no vulnerable resident should ever be left feeling abandoned and entrapped in their own home. And that lift remains unrepaired, unrepairable, with no end date in sight as of now. My second example is Mitchett Heath, a not-for-profit retirement community managed by Cognatum Estates. This is an issue that I know affects residents who have members of Parliament from across this House. Older residents, again, feeling completely ignored and now maligned by the company who should be looking after them. Residents who have invested their life savings in homes but have no voice in how those properties are managed. Now, and last month I met a group of Cognatum residents here in Parliament. One described Cognatum as the worst commercial organisation I have dealt with in a long professional career. And nobody in the room looked surprised at that. Residents described soaring service charges, complaints that went nowhere, a regulator, the ARHM that they don't believe is independent, a tribunal process that's so expensive and where lease terms can allow the managing company to recover legal costs from residents, and they simply give up trying to engage in that process. They spoke about residents' forums disappearing, residents having to renegotiate electricity contracts on behalf of the management company because they're so incapable of doing it themselves. And I think the most extraordinary thing that we heard was that Cognatum refusing to allow defibrillators to be located in a retirement community because they are fearful that members of the public might seek to access those defibrillators from outside of the state altogether. Can I simply conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, if you will allow me just a few more seconds to ask the Minister...
Order. No, there is a very strict time limit. Sarah Russell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I want to thank my right honourable friend for Vauxhall and Camberwell for this debate and all the work that she has done on it. And also, I can see that Lord Best is in the gallery, and I know that he, amongst many others, have been campaigning on these issues for years. I rise really to draw attention to the experiences of some of the leaseholders in my constituency. I have spoken at length before about unadopted estates in this chamber, so I'm not going to dwell on that today because it doesn't touch on the Select Committee report, but I would like to just draw this to the Minister's attention again as a major issue in my constituency relating to this. But to turn to the specific problems that we have, the draft legislation as it stands is fantastic, and the proposal to cap ground rents will be absolutely life-changing for people in my constituency who have contacted me and talked about ground rents that are going up to double, about the difficulties that they are having consistently with the fact that there appears to be no real ability to hold a managing agent to account at all whatsoever. The specifics that I wanted to talk about today, though, is a case that I've been working with the homeowners, well, the leaseholders, for some time, where Firstport, yet again, are the managing agents, where they're having finally managed to dislodge Firstport as the managing agents. The residents have been told by the new managing agent that the £40,000 reserve that they believed was available to them, there's none. There is nothing. Firstport have not explained where that money has gone, what it has been spent on, and this has now been the outstanding position for well over 6 months. £40,000 is a lot of money to just vanish, and you would think that an organisation would be able to point to what it had been spent on pretty readily if they were keeping accounts in any normal fashion. This has been part of a succession of difficulties that these leaseholders have had with Firstport, and this has been going on for years and years and years. I understand that the government has concerns that the draft legislation as it is already exceptionally long, and as a lawyer I have a huge amount of sympathy for that. But I completely agree with my right honourable friend for Vauxhall and Camberwell Green and her Select Committee and the members thereof that we absolutely have to do something in line with Lord Best's previous recommendations about the regulation of managing agents. We have been talking about this topic in this House for as long as I've been an MP, and clearly significantly longer than that. If these organisations were capable of self-regulation, and if educating people who worked within them was sufficient to solve this problem, it would have been solved a long time ago. No one wants regulation for the sake of it, but the only way that there will be accountability for vast amounts of individuals' money that appears to simply vanish into the ether is if we put regulation in place. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I commend my right honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall and Camberwell Green, for securing this important debate and for her continued strong and effective leadership of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. I've spoken several times in this House about the problems with the current leasehold and property management system, more recently from the opposition front bench. Like so many of my constituents and people across the country, I am a leaseholder and I know firsthand the horrific situation that they face. But in today's debate, I'd like to focus on property management companies who are bringing misery to the lives of both leaseholders and those living on freehold estates in so-called fleecehold properties. Apart from the law as it currently stands, it is poor performance and, quite frankly, total incompetence of companies such as RMG and Firstport that are, quite frankly, at the root of so many issues facing leaseholders across the country. Since my election, I have not come across one property management company that residents are happy with, whether it's Highley in Hoddesdon, Academia, Robinia Road or Watery Lane in Turnford, Aldermere Avenue or Mongolia Way in Flamstead End, or Eleanor House in Waltham Cross. It's hard to think of one part of Broxthorne not affected by this. The Minister, who I get on well with, has promised to strengthen the regulation of managing agents, but how much longer will my constituents have to wait? His department has already held a consultation on measures to help leaseholders challenge unfair fees and charges and introduce qualifications for managing agents. In fact, the consultation opened nearly exactly 1 year ago and closed in September 2025, and the government are still analysing the feedback, and this is what the people out there get fed up with. The Leasehold and Freehold Act 2024 is on the statute book. The present government clearly wants stronger regulation on managing agents, as that is what they've told this House, so why the delay? We need to get this sorted. So I welcome the fact that the government have brought forward a Commonhold and Leasehold bill, and the fact they allowed the committee that I am on to scrutinise it in its draft form. That is a positive sign that the government wants to get the right legislation in place for our constituents. But I feel the government should commit to giving more powers to the department so that ministers can hold managing agents to account with specifically enforcement powers. Managing agents that break the rules should be fined and ultimately stripped of their licence to operate. This would mean that management companies actually have to start to care about the interests of the residents they're supposed to look out for. In my constituency of Broxbourne, we have had to put up with poor service charges and increasing bills for years. Residents have nowhere to turn when something goes wrong. They feel like that managing agents have all of the power. I know the Minister wants to change that, and I hope he will reflect carefully on what has been said across the House today, and I urge the government to get a move on and solve this issue for millions of people across the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Thank you to my honourable friend from Vauxhall and Camberwell Green for her excellent work and her committee members' excellent work at pre-legislative scrutiny, which we've heard about today. Since becoming an MP, one of the most common issues I hear from my constituents is the poor quality of service provided by managing agents to local leaseholders. When the boilers broke at Walsham Court and Hinns Court last November, residents tried to contact Anthem to no avail and were left without water for 4 weeks. At Middlesex House, residents were left without water for days, without extra support and supplies until my office intervened. At Armstrong House, Firstport has let the quality of communal areas deteriorate to a shockingly poor extent. I could go on for hours, but have yet 3 minutes to go. But as members have said, there are countless examples of service failure from managing agents. I welcome the Minister's actions to date and the proposals in the draft bill to cap exploitative ground rents, which will save thousands of pounds over the lifetime of leases, pushing for service charge reform and transparency, and pushing towards Commonhold as the default form of tenure, long overdue changes. But having seen these cases firsthand, I know more is needed, and my 10-minute rule bill in the last session proposed to establish an independent regulator of managing agents, modelled off the excellent recommendations of Lord Best's 2019 report. I understand the government are willing to move on mandatory qualifications for managing agents, which again is welcome, but I'm concerned that without an independent regulator to enforce codes of conduct and ensure these qualifications reap benefits, it will be of little benefit to many leaseholders. Furthermore, without a dedicated regulator, the burden of enforcement would continue to fall upon individual leaseholders and in future common holders to take up lengthy and expensive legal action to hold their managing agents to account. I think there's also 3 key benefits of why a managing agent regulator is also desirable. Firstly, good regulation is good for markets. I think this will help growth, not hinder it. There are significant costs and financial waste in the current system, and the leasehold product has been exceptionally damaged by the poor behaviour of managing agents, and a regulator has the chance to restore confidence in leasehold and commonhold in future. Second, introducing a regulator for managing agents would help ensure the success of the commonhold tenure. The need for managing agents will not go away with the introduction of commonhold. And thirdly, introducing a regulator for managing agents is something strongly supported by those in the system, both customer, the leaseholder, and also the provider of services themselves. As the chair of the Select Committee has mentioned, leaseholders responded overwhelmingly they want to see this change as part of their survey. And the TPI, RICS, and even managing directors of Firstport and Ramsden and Ritter are all supportive of the need for more effective regulation and a regulator of managing agents. Those in the industry understand there is nothing to gain by the poor behaviour of some undermining the good behaviour of many more. Yes, we need to take forward the existing important proposals in the draft bill, but the time for the regulation of managing agents is now in this bill. It is vital that something is done and is clearly seen to be done before the next election for existing leaseholders struggling day in, day out with rogue managing agents. The establishment of a regulator would be a clear signal to existing leaseholders that we are serious about protecting them, as well as a signal to the property and construction sectors. This government is focused on restoring stability to the housing market and, crucially, a signal calling time on the poor practice of rogue managing agents, which are far too common in our system, finally fulfilling the promise of ending Fleecehold for good.
Sean Berry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the Chair of the Select Committee to support her motion and welcome her report and its recommendations for the bill. Thorough and fair leasehold reform is long overdue. My inbox as MP for Brighton Pavilion is littered with horror stories from constituents about their experiences as leaseholders forced to fork out extortionate service charges with no value for money, poor maintenance and no transparency on how that money is spent, as well as awful communications. And my leaseholders continue to suffer from lack of agency in solving the building safety scandal too, which has left Brighton's many high-rise and mid-rise blocks, too many leaseholders in which are stuck in unsafe homes. Some of my constituents tell me they believe freeholders are still trying to cut corners and do this work on the cheap. And just last month, I was contacted by multiple constituents about developer Barrett Redrow's plans to remediate their blocks in one part of my constituency built in the early 2000s to a B1 standard rather than A2 standard, as they had understood would happen. This type of dispute is commonplace 9 years on from the avoidable Grenfell disaster, and it's so worrying for too many of my constituents. But I too also want to talk about property management agents. A large number of leaseholders in Brighton and Hove are in a nightmare situation right now of not being able to access money paid into accounts managed by just one large property management company in sudden crisis. Under current leasehold regulations, when a management agent's client accounts are frozen or irregularities identified which suggests mismanagement of accounts, leaseholders are left exposed to very big financial losses. In the private rented sector, there is a government-backed tenancy guarantee scheme, but for leaseholders, there is no equivalent guarantee on service charge accounts and reserve funds. Section 42 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1987 does require property management companies to hold service charge contributions in trust and with a financial institution authorised under the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000. Yet, the flexibility of how leaseholder money is held in reality means that the sums of money in property management company accounts may far exceed the maximum amounts guaranteed under the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. Section 156 of the Commonhold and Leasehold Reform Act 2002 adds a requirement for management agents to hold service charge funds in designated separate accounts, but it is not yet in force. This lack of enactment does seem to leave wide open the potential for management agents to hold leaseholder money in a way that falls outside of compensation schemes, and it cannot be right that leaseholders are left exposed to risk in this way. To conclude, there is no doubt that the feudal leasehold system is broken and it must be abolished in favour of Commonhold, and that regulation of management agents and to end their exploitation is very, very urgent. Promises made when the current government were in opposition to end this system within the first 100 days were missed long ago. But we need full reform to ensure that situations which result in leaseholders being ripped off, living in unsafe homes, or exposed to avoidable financial risk and losses now end without delay.
Lee Ingham.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I congratulate my friend, the Honourable Member for Vauxhall and Camberwell Green, on securing this incredibly important debate. This issue is actually the reason I got into politics. My first community activism was with my fellow neighbours against an unscrupulous developer up in Newcastle. So what I learned from that is when people are trapped in their own homes by systems which have been designed to extract money from them rather than serve them, they need a government that's on their side. And for too long, leaseholders haven't had this at all. I am so glad that this government has taken strong steps already on Commonhold and Leasehold. There's so much that does need to change. And as many of you have spoken about today, in the past, Leasehold has been used as a system that's allowed developers to treat homeowners as a revenue stream, escalating service charges with no breakdown, poor maintenance resulting in unsafe parks, and then problems with footpaths, dying trees, and to make matters even worse and more insulting, really poor communication from managing agents, which makes it really difficult to get your voice heard or your complaint addressed. So I have been working with residents locally on estates like Marston Grange, Sancerre Grange, Sheridan Grange, to help them register and build residents' associations, to raise their cases with managing agents so they can get better maintenance. And working together, we've genuinely had some great results. But for residents on new build estates, it shouldn't be how active or vocal your local MP is. It should be written into law, and I'm urging the government to make sure property managing agents are sufficiently regulated. I'm going to give you a couple of quick examples of cases in my constituency. First, a case from Gateway Avenue in Baldwin's Gate, raised at my coffee morning last week. At their AGM, the residents wanted to form a housing association, a management company, but they were blocked, and one is being imposed on them against their wishes. St George's Estate in Stafford, residents have reported that it genuinely feels like the managing agent is stealing money from us, to the tune of £600 to £1,000 per leaseholder, and they've been trebled of those charges. And they now have to pay £2,500 to change the rent review period on their lease to be able to remortgage or sell. It's just deeply unfair as a system. And at Deans Park Court, a retirement complex, I know others have spoken about this, residents in their own flats describe management charges as extortionate. The company just refuses to engage meaningfully. And at Adlington Brooklands House in Stafford, a constituent grounds rent has written year on year, now stands at almost £2,000, which is nearly 6 times the national average. I could go on and on, to be honest, Madam Deputy Speaker, but I think I've made my point quite clear. The government has taken bold and decisive steps already in capping ground rent and abolishing forfeiture, making Commonhold the default for new flats, and these are really significant reforms. But the HCLG committee has called for the absence of independent regulation of property managing agents a significant shortcoming, and every one of my constituents and I would agree with that. Lord Best has recommended an independent regulator with the powers to fine agents and revoke licences as far back as 2019. It's now 2026. I think the case has been made consistently, and delivering it would be a tremendous contribution of this Labour government.
On that point, my honourable friend, give way.
Of course, yeah.
Would you agree with me that it would also give some comfort to my poor residents, both on Ribblesdale Avenue in Accrington and also on Linden Park Estate in Great Harwood, when they're currently faced with the impending truth that First Port will be their managing agent shortly, and they are rightfully terrified of actually what this might mean to them and the expense that having a house might be added to them, as well as the failure of these organisations to manage local parks, etc. And so taking these steps, she says, will help give confidence to my residents that they will have the protections they deserve.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I can wholeheartedly agree with what she says. I think the First Port piece, particularly given the amount of times they've been called to Parliament, you know, they've come to speak before HLG committee, but also the Labour leaseholders group that have worked really hard. I think it's an abomination they're still getting contracts, to be honest, given their record. As someone who used to award contracts in my previous career, I think it's mad when previous behaviour isn't taken into account when we're giving these contracts out. And they are a case in point of absolutely atrocious behaviour. But just going back to my own experience and learning from them, I'm helping constituents on my estates across the constituency right now, as I'm sure many of you are, to form residents' associations to fight back. But I just think we're beyond that. We shouldn't need to be fighting back anymore. We should have the regulation in place to protect us.
Peter Lamb.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I very much welcome, as I'm sure do most of my colleagues on these benches, the government's actions so far on Commonhold and Leasehold, and I look forward to further steps emerging. Today I'd like to speak on the issue of property management agents, and particularly in the context of unadopted estates. As with so many issues, fundamentally the issue is a lack of housing. Despite the enormous actions taken by this government and by past actions to try and get the housing market moving, the reality is that housing delivery in this country collapsed in the wake of the 1984 Housing Act. Anyone who looks at a graph of housing delivery since that point can see that the mass exit of the state from direct delivery of housing has never come close to being replaced by the private sector, which is one of the reasons why I was very excited this week to see comments by the Secretary of State talking about the potential mass re-entry of this government into housing delivery. It is one of the very few things that can resolve this, because what we fundamentally have here is a broken market. People are forced to accept unreasonable conditions on their housing because they have no choice. And until we resolve the broken market, we're going to continue to have various forms of exploitation coming forward. The reality is developers, and there are good developers and bad developers, but they overwhelmingly will seek to minimise their costs as far as possible, whatever the impact on the communities they are creating. And if we allow poor practices to be possible within the law, then we will see poor practices being delivered by these people. We need to be mindful, of course, that regulation has an impact. As someone who has delivered local plans, I can tell you I was always very mindful of the requirements that I was putting on developers because I knew every single requirement I put on was an affordable house being taken out of the system. And we as legislators sometimes, I think, have been a bit careless in some of the additional requirements we've put on without them being fundamentally necessary. We have to make sure that regulation is proportionate, but in this case, it very much is. I've been dealing with the issue of unadopted estates for the better part of 2 decades now, and no worse example exists in my experience than that of Forge Wood, a neighbourhood which, despite being part of a new town which has all the services and the neighbourhood principle would deliver for a neighbourhood, unlike my other neighbourhoods in Forge Wood, they're all having to pay for it effectively a second time, once through their council tax and the second time through their unadopted or through their management agency, at a fee that effectively rivals the exact same level of council tax as the district authority. They're paying more for less services. There are questions over the nature of the contracts and the contractors brought in. And if you look at any of these property management agencies and you see the company secretaries listed, they're registered for hundreds, if not thousands, of these companies. How effective can you be when you're registered for 1,000? It's very little more than just fee farming, frankly, for my residents for no actual benefit. If you go through the Articles of Association, as I have done, to try and find ways for residents to wrest control back, the complexities in there effectively mean these people are completely unaccountable. It's masquerading as ownership by those communities while delivering an unaccountable system. So what do we do? Well, I think the existing proposals brought forward by the government are an improvement, and I very much welcome the Select Committee's recommendation of the independent regulator, which should come into effect. But on the issue of unadopted estates, ultimately we now have to turn off the tap. We need to establish fixed conditions and fees so these are all adopted at the point in which they are completed and handed over to local authorities. We also need to establish a pathway for existing unadopted estates to be taken on by the state with a need for local authorities to be able to plan out the way in which they can bring these in. I very much believe it is possible within the existing system and with the existing financial constraints to adopt these, but you cannot do that when sending up at the moment, we're running up a flag to tell every developer in the country to ditch their responsibility to get these sites adopted. So I'm very pleased by the recommendations before today. I'm very pleased with the government recommendations, but further action is needed on an independent regulator and on turning off the tap on unadopted estates. Thank you.
Abdusam Mohammed.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the exploitation in the leasehold system are endless. Unfair service charges, ground rents, marriage value, buybacks, hidden costs in utilities, inflated insurance, the list goes on and on, as do the ways that freeholders line their pockets while ordinary homeowners bear the costs. We saw this acutely in Sheffield, with disgraced solicitor Andrew Milne buying up hundreds of freeholds at £250 and then shamefully charging homeowners extortionate prices to buy them back. He has rightfully faced consequences with the SRA and the police for blackmail, but it was only a few months ago that residents in Walkley and my constituency were also receiving letters, legal letters, saying that their leases would be soon up for sale, leaving them worried about whether they too would be subjected to extortion. No one should be living with that kind of fear. Across developments of Columbia Place, Mill Sands, Riverside House, Anchor Point and Little Kellam in my constituency, residents speak with one voice. The problems in their homes are overwhelming. The responsibility to chase managing agents is taking up their time, and they are being charged extortionate amounts for work that never seems to happen properly or at all. 2 weeks ago, I met with over 40 members from Little Kellam. Their stories told one horror after another. I heard from a family with a 6-year-old child living in a home with a broken window who was told by the managing agent that there wasn't enough money to fix. Another family were told to move out from their home for repairs for 6 weeks. It ended up being 14 months. And then, when they moved back to the property, the repairs were incomplete. Another told me that her service charge went up by 250%, and when she challenged this, so opaque were the figures and how they were calculated that they were then dropped. Many others complain who try to take over the management of their properties, that when they request finalised accounts, these never materialise. The lack of financial transparency is staggering. It shows that not only are these isolated failures, but symptoms of wider structural problems. There are 2 things that my constituents are calling for above everything else: transparency in their arrangements and accountability when things go sadly wrong. Today's motion rightly says that the absence of statutory regulation for property management agents represents a major weakness in our plans for reform. The committee makes clear, as does the evidence in Lord Best's review, that voluntary self-regulation has not delivered the standards that leaseholders deserve, nor will it deliver the accountability they want. Where management agents repeatedly fail residents, I'm afraid that simply issuing guidance is just not enough. The regulator should be able to impose meaningful financial penalties and, where appropriate, remove licences altogether. Leaseholders deserve far greater transparency over their service charges. They deserve stronger rights to challenge unreasonable costs and easier routes to replace managing agents who fail to deliver. So we've got to seize the opportunity that we have now, and we must ensure that managing agents are properly regulated. That is the action that my leaseholders deserve, and that is the action that I hope the Minister will carry out in following through the recommendations of the Select Committee.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very glad to be able to contribute to this debate today, to give voice to a number of my constituents who've been suffering as a result of the feudal leasehold system for far too long. And may I thank my honourable friend, the Chair of the Housing, Community and Local Government Select Committee, for setting out so many of the issues that so many of our constituents face. The measures outlined in the draft Commonhold and Leasehold Reform Bill mark a significant step towards a fairer and more balanced system of home ownership. So I thank the Minister for all his work on this. I know he is very alive to the many issues and is working hard to deliver on the many pledges we were elected on in our manifesto. For generations, the leasehold system has left many homeowners paying substantial service charges, ground rents and administration fees while having little control over the management of the buildings they live in. Too often, leaseholders have found themselves trapped in a system that is expensive, complex and heavily weighted in favour of freeholders. And these issues do not discriminate on size, be them small blocks or larger developments. In Luton South and South Bedfordshire, I have constituents living in a small block of 12 flats, Harrowden Court, of which Hastow Housing are the freeholders, who've raised a number of issues with me in recent years relating to Hastow's management of the block. This includes significant communication issues and substantial bills presented to leaseholders with little to no explanation of why they're expected to pay these charges. Most recently, my constituents were notified by Hastow of significant service charge increases over the next 2 financial years, 26-27, 27-28, to fund fire safety and external wall remediation works. Tenant service charge and sinking fund contributions to cover these costs will now rise from around £250 to £900 per month. This is an unaffordable increase that has caused considerable shock, stress and anxiety. Residents are also concerned about a lack of transparency, as Hastow has not provided estimated total costs, explained how charges are distributed to residents or evidenced any competitive procurement process for carrying out these works. Not only this, but such remediation work should be the responsibility of the building developer, and it's extremely unfair these costs are being passed on to residents. This is just one example of leaseholders being failed. I have a number of constituents living in Stockwood Gardens, a larger development of 11 blocks managed by MCR Homes, who are facing a similar reality, paying increased service charges year upon year with little to no explanation as to why. And basic maintenance services they were promised, including grass cutting and building maintenance, provided at a subpar standard or not at all. Many have also reported basic faults within their blocks, such as lights in hallways not working or regular leaks, which have been reported and not fixed, with no clear timetable for repair. It's clear from these examples alone there is a significant power imbalance in the current leasehold system, and companies managing these properties essentially have free rein to overcharge residents and under-deliver on services, with little to no transparency or accountability. So I note that the HCLG Select Committee has done extensive scrutiny work on the draft bill, and their report recommends the final bill includes provisions to establish a new independent public body as a regulator for property managing agents, with enforcement powers including the ability to issue fines or revoke licences of managing agents who breach a statutory code of practice. I support this recommendation and believe this is an opportunity to prevent bad practice and drive cultural change within the industry, whilst affording leaseholders greater protections. I welcome the legislation coming forward, but it cannot be the end of the conversation. The voices and concerns of leaseholders must continue to be heard if we are to fully address the problems within the leasehold system and ensure our constituents feel the benefit of these reforms once and for all.
Justin Madders.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I just start by referring the Chamber to my chairmanship of the Leasehold and Commonhold Reform APPG, where I work closely with organisations such as the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership and the National Leasehold Campaign, who I pay tribute to. As we've heard, complaints from constituents dealing with management companies and the exorbitant fees they charge are something that we're all dealing with now on a weekly basis. This is not a new phenomenon, of course. This is something I raised in the House 5 years ago because I could see this becoming the next big scandal, and sadly it has come to pass. Homeowners who buy their homes in good faith understandably expect to live in a functioning estate where responsibilities are clear and, where necessary, charges are fair. All too often, as we've heard, the opposite is the case. Homeowners are left in a pernicious situation where they pay for services once in their council tax bill and once again in extortionate service charges. And often these poor services exacerbated by there being no accountability for it. Residents are forced to persistently chase matters while frequently being passed from one organisation to another without resolution. But as soon as they fall behind with a payment, these companies leap into action, often using aggressive debt collection tactics. Adding insult to injury, the financial structures of these estates are all too frequently opaque. Governance structures lack transparency, companies are labelled as dormant for accounting purposes, and the dodgy practice where freeholders, management companies and debt recovery companies operate in an interconnected web allows them to rack up eye-watering fees. One very recent example from my constituency is a constituent who was owed some service charges to RMG, who I think we all are familiar with. Looking at the bill, the constituent has been charged on top of his service charges an instruction fee and a client admin fee, adding another £600 to the bill. Yet somehow RMG have managed to inflate the £1,100 owed in service charges to £3,300 by the time court papers have been issued. There is no world where a trebling of the sum can be justified, and it just shows what a scam the system is. I see time and again people raising problems from a range of new build developments in my constituency, including Legend Garden Village, Merseyview and Jackswood Estates, where homeowners face a range of challenges. In Legend Garden Village, residents are facing combined service charges, fees running into hundreds of thousands of pounds, for which only a fraction of the spending can be accounted for. That just adds salt into the wound. They don't actually have any idea how this money is being spent, if it's being spent on the estate at all. They don't know if the companies are getting best value for money, how reserves are used, or how costs are allocated over different phases of the development. There are persistent maintenance issues, inconsistent grounds maintenance and safety concerns because of poor traffic management. People who buy their homes in good faith deserve better. Then there's the Jackswood Estate in Ellesmere Port and the Merseyview Estate in Bromborough, where the adoption process is effectively stalled, leaving residents in limbo. And I know that the regulation of managing agents is clearly something that this House would like to see, but there are some other suggestions I would like to make to add to that. We could introduce standard costs across the country for estate management fees, so that would be a baseline from which to judge these companies. Residents could be given a far greater say over who manages their estate. We could have 3 yearly ballots in law about whether they wish to carry on with the same management agents. This could end the put up or shut up approach that a lot of these companies actually adopt. And an immediate step the government could make, which I think we've already heard suggested in today's debate, is that it could now be made a condition of any planning permission moving forward that the developers have to hand over the whole estate adoption to the local authority and pay a community sum for it, ending that revenue stream entirely. And for estates that have been built by developers and abandoned, local authorities, I will give way.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the point about estate adoption, I wonder if he agrees with me that we need to get on and implement Section 42 of the Floodwater Management Act that would require sewerage to be adopted as part of the public sewer as soon as possible.
Yes, indeed. That brings me to the Merseyview estate, where we've actually no, it's a different estate. It's one in Easton where the residents have been paying for a sewer that they can't actually locate, and it just shows that there's too much ambiguity in what these charges are going for. And one final thing that local authorities could be required to do is actually be given powers to actually use their resources to bring estates up to adoptable level and then charge the developers for it retrospectively, because the developers don't want to do it. We need to find a way of breaking that long gun. I think those are just some of the measures that would actually improve the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, alongside, of course, the many reforms which I welcome from this government.
Julie Minns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I would like to thank my honourable friend for securing this very important debate, which I know will be of interest to some of my Carlisle constituents who find themselves victims of Fleecehold. Across the country, too many people are now buying homes on freehold estates and then finding themselves let down by the developers and the estate management companies that fail to deliver the services they promise. Developers build these estates, sell the homes, and then, despite levying management charges, often fail to maintain the essential infrastructure that residents rely on every day, whether it's roads, drainage systems, as we just heard, or shared green spaces. And I've seen this firsthand in the experience of residents of Moorside Drive, which is a development by Gleeson Homes. My constituent Daniel first contacted me in July last year after purchasing his home in October 2024. He'd been assured that the outstanding work would be completed by March 2025. That deadline slipped to the spring, then to the summer, and as things stand, residents have yet to receive any meaningful communication about when the work will finally be completed. The problems they face are significant. The road serving the estate has deteriorated and remains unfinished. The shared green spaces that were promised as part of the development have still not been delivered. And commitments to enhance and protect biodiversity have yet to be fulfilled. Communication with residents has also fallen well below an acceptable standard. Daniel tells me he was given no notice before work began directly outside his family home, and I've heard that traffic management measures were not properly put in place during other works, creating unnecessary disruption and safety concerns. Landscaping, meanwhile, cannot be completed until the roads are finished, and unresolved drainage issues continue to affect a number of residents on the estate. This is not like being sold a faulty item in a shop that can simply be returned. These are people's homes, the places where they expect to build their lives, raise their families, and feel secure. When developers and management companies fail to honour their commitments, it's residents who are left with living with the consequences. That's why reform and regulation is so important. Homeowners deserve transparency, accountability, and effective regulation of the companies responsible for managing their estates. They should not, and we've heard it already this afternoon, have to fight for basic standards of maintenance or chase endlessly for information about works that should have been completed months earlier. I very much welcome the work of this Labour government to strengthen the rights of people living on managed estates. These reforms have the potential to deliver greater fairness, improve accountability, and ensure that homeowners receive the standards of service they have paid for. People who invest in a home deserve confidence that those responsible for maintaining their communities will fulfil their obligations. It's only right that we continue to strengthen protections for homeowners and ensure that managing agents and developers are held to account.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank my honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall and Camberwell Green, for the assiduous work that she has done with the Select Committee. It's inspiring when we as backbenchers can have genuine influence by bringing the concerns of our constituents to this House of Commons and directly into the minds of ministers, and when there are improvements that result in that. And I can recall my honourable friend, the Housing Minister, who I believe used his mobile phone to instruct officials to call in the CEO of First Port from a debate because he was hearing so many complaints from honourable members. I'd like to touch on a couple of examples from my constituency. One constituent who was a customer of First Port had their service charge increased from £980 in 2023 to £3,800 in 2026, causing financial hardship because they took out a loan to pay the previous bill, and now they say that the property is unsellable. There was a clear lack of transparency when repeated requests for service charge accounts were allegedly ignored. Another constituent, Madam Deputy Speaker, reported significant concerns about First Port property management, highlighting that service charges increased from around £1,000 in 2021 to £3,400 in 2026 for broadly unchanged services. They, again, allege lack of transparency and more. Residents ultimately exercised their right to manage and appointed a new managing agent, which estimates comparable services at around £1,600 per year, suggesting that First Port's charges were unduly high. Now, I want to pay tribute to the work of the Labour for Leaseholders, and particularly the honourable member, my honourable friend, the member for Cities of London and Westminster and for Hendon. And we held a mini-inquiry, and we gave evidence to that inquiry. And it's pretty clear, I think it was clear to all honourable members, that there is a captive market and that private companies and others are exploiting people within the law, perhaps, but we've seen the behaviour of these companies and we are calling it out. And one has to ask why and whose interests are being served, and I will merely leave that question there. I want to, if I can, in the remaining time, Madam Deputy Speaker, move on to something that started as a negative and ended up more as a positive. That is when residents of Eastfield House, a block of flats in Holton, in my constituency, managed by Clarion Housing, repeatedly contacted me about problems. I went out to see them. I went to one of the flats. I saw the various problems with maintenance, lack of transparency, frankly, the usual story. It was deeply concerning. I saw the anguish and the stress and the upset of these people who are having their dignity disrespected and damaged. I then contacted Clarion, who very generously then attended a meeting I held with residents a few weeks later, and they are taking action. They have already given a payment to those residents. They have a single point of contact. They have an action plan. They are doing what they can to improve the situation. I merely want to pay tribute to them. It shows that things can improve. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act 2024 was a very good start, and I know that the government is consulting further. This government is intervening in failing markets, because without this, the market, the participants in this market will continue to do the bare minimum, or worse, to exploit people. Of course I'll give way.
I thank him very much for giving way on that point. Does he agree with me that far from being anti-growth, a proper regulator for the property management sector would be a pro-growth measure, bringing transparency and good functioning to these incredibly opaque markets which exploit leaseholders and renters?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. I do agree entirely with that. As I was saying, the market is failing, and many of the participants in this market will continue to do the bare minimum or, at worst, exploit people. Some of the companies and individuals, as we've heard from honourable members, will continue to push the limits of decency and possibly legality, because there is no accountability. So let's make it as hard as we possibly can for them. Let's protect and empower the people who really count, who are the leaseholders. So in the remaining seconds that I have, I would ask the Minister to touch on the points raised by my right honourable friend, the member for Hayes and Harlington earlier, that the right to manage process be looked at, and I would suggest that the right to manage threshold be reduced to 30%, or that a deemed consent process is brought in, so that our residents can take control of poor estate management. We owe it to them. They deserve dignity in the housing that they have purchased.
Barry Gardner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. For 28 of the 29 years that I've been in Parliament, I have campaigned for leasehold reform. I was instrumental in the 2002 Act. I was on the Bill Committee for the 2024 Act. And I welcome the Select Committee's report, and I pay tribute to the Chair of the Committee for her remarks this afternoon. I have 11,000 individual leaseholders in contact with my office. And I want to pay tribute to Jackie George, who is in daily contact with hundreds of them. She is my office manager, and most of what she does with leaseholders is actually in her spare time. Leasehold reform is about control. It's about passing power and control from the moneyed interests to the people whose homes they affect. And to do this, we have to enact the remaining Law Commission recommendations on enfranchisement and right to manage. For enfranchisement, that means restricting development value. It was promised to Parliament by the last government in 2021, and it was meant to be in the 24 Act. It's just wrong that leaseholders can be held to ransom by hypothetical development value, developers claiming that they could build in the garden or on top of the building and demand huge extra sums to stop leaseholders from affording the freehold purchase. Nicola Muir, a barrister at Tanfield Chambers, has wryly observed that it's amazing what development landlords believe is possible and the profits they claim they will generate. She cited one instance. The landlord initially claimed £34 million for the alleged potential to build a skyscraper in the front garden of a block. Today, the right to manage is a shadow of what the Labour government legislated for in the 2002 Act. Freeholders can punish leaseholders who have taken back control of their blocks with the right to manage because of the Supreme Court decision in 2022, the Settlers' Court decision, which went against the intention of Parliament by allowing freeholders to retain control of estate charges. We need to revert to the pre-Settlers' Court position, and the Law Commission's remaining right to manage recommendations would help to achieve this. An entire legal industry has emerged in torpedoing right to manage claims for freeholders, where tiny procedural details can see leaseholders spending literally a fortune to defend their right to manage in tribunal and the courts, only to lose the claim. The tribunal has no power to waive errors made over the procedural traps, and yet the reforms to change this, the remaining Law Commission right to manage recommendations that would end frivolous lawfare of freeholders and make right to manage a universal scheme, have been omitted from the bill despite previous promises. I'm conscious that the scale of the leasehold crisis has become much worse since the Law Commission issued its final report 6 years ago, and that there are quick win policies that could still be added to the bill, such as reducing the arbitrary 50% trigger for right to manage claims, as many members have already said, to 30 or 35%. Just imagine, Madam Deputy Speaker, if we had a law that said a bad government could only be removed if 50% of all citizens with franchise, not just those who actually voted in election, had to support the proposition. That is the situation with leasehold. If the right to manage is a no-fault right.
Bel Rabiro Addy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend and constituency neighbour for bringing forward this important debate, because leasehold has become the ultimate con. Now, with the sheer quantity of leaseholder issues and the behaviour of property management agents that I and my team come across weekly, you would think we were experts in this area, but no two cases are the same, and each one is as complicated as the last, if not more so. So my first point is that the system of leasehold is far too complicated. Whether we are looking at WS1 forms, cladding, major works, service charge transparency, it involves a number of different parties, each with their own interests. And the vast majority end with all avenues being exhausted and the constituent having to seek legal advice. But not everyone has the time to go back and forth with their MP, to raise internal complaints through every mechanism, and then go on to complain to the Ombudsman. Not everyone has the time and resources to seek legal support for their case. There are thousands of leaseholders encountering these issues, and they are completely locked out of accessing support. And past legislation to improve leaseholder rights seems to have added an extra layer of complexity. So any new legislation must simplify the system, not further complicate matters. I just want to put on record my specific concern for leaseholders in housing association buildings. Whilst recent legislation has improved leaseholder rights in privately owned blocks, housing association freeholders have often fallen outside the scope of these reforms. So housing associations must be specifically addressed in future legislation. Now on to the unregulated headache that are management agents. There absolutely needs to be a mechanism of oversight and enforcement. So I welcome the recommendation for an independent regulator, but the regulator needs not just teeth but claws. They need to be able to fine them, remove their licences and prosecute those repeat offenders we know that are gaming the system. Madam Deputy Speaker, I cannot tell you how many cases I deal with where the constituent is just trying to get a response from their property management agent. Frustrated leaseholders are paying for their service through their ever-increasing service charges, and it's simply not right that they are struggling to even get a basic response. Charges climb year on year, but transparency does not climb with them. My constituents ask for a proper breakdown of what they're actually paying for, and too often they get vague figures, unanswered emails, or silence. Broken lifts, unsafe stairwells, communal areas that never get cleaned, and still the bill arrives unchanged and unexplained, and leaseholders have no real power to challenge what they're being charged for. And heaven forbid they actually refuse to pay their service charge because the communication they once begged for comes swiftly in the form of threatening letters to claim the debt. I would like the House to reflect on the fact that this would not be tolerated anywhere else. Ofgem, which isn't even always that great, ordered E.ON Energy to pay £5 million after customers were left waiting on hold for 18 minutes on average. Half their calls never even getting through. It was able to fine Maxon Power £1.65 million for poor communication and mishandled accounts. Just this January, a landlord in Harrow was prosecuted and fined £9,000 for failing to provide fire and electrical safety certificates, and a landlord who fails to carry out an annual gas safety check faces an unlimited fine of up to 6 months in prison. And in every single one of those cases, Parliament decided that taking someone's money and failing to deliver a bad service carries real consequences. Yet management agents can take thousands of pounds a year from leaseholders, deliver next to nothing, and walk away with a strongly worded letter. We do not accept that anywhere else in housing law. We cannot keep accepting it here. So an independent regulator must do what they have not been able to do in the past, and that is remove the licences, fine them, and as I said, prosecute them where necessary, because what these organisations have been doing is absolutely criminal.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and could I thank my honourable friend, the Chair of the Select Committee, for her work, and indeed the whole committee and the experts who've testified as well. I'd like to speak in favour of the government's proposals and briefly describe the situation in my constituency of Central Reading, as my honourable friend pointed out earlier, the Wild West of management agents. My residents, too many of them, Madam Deputy Speaker, face deep frustration, even anger, because of the actions of these companies. In many cases, people have worked extremely hard to get a foot on the housing ladder. They bought an attractive flat in what they thought was a nice development, only to be let down extremely badly by these companies who treat them in an appalling way, offer very poor service and high costs. I'd like to mention two particular case studies. The first one is of an attractive development in West Reading where Remus is the managing agent. This is near to a large Tesco. There are parks nearby, attractive redevelopment of a former hospital site with low and medium-rise brick buildings that fit the built environment. Many young families living there. It's a pleasant, or it should be a pleasant place to live. However, there are some problems with antisocial behaviour, and Remus have persistently failed to respond to very reasonable inquiries and requests by residents. For example, failing for months to repair shutters that provide the entrance to a car park and allowing antisocial behaviour to creep into a car park under residents' properties. Failing to restore hot water, which was unavailable in some of the flats. A whole series of other problems, including expecting residents to pay for the upkeep and the closure of a park, where there's some antisocial behaviour problems. Related issues with, I believe, other management companies involve nearby parking problems, where roads have issues with parking. And this is all causing extreme problems and stress for residents in this area. I had a public meeting with a number of residents recently, and this was explained very clearly to me, and rightly residents are outraged by the behaviour of these companies. And the potential for reform, as my honourable friend rightly pointed out earlier, and other colleagues have as well, is very, very clear. In one of the blocks in this area, that the residents have gone through the extremely lengthy process of getting Commonhold, and that has led to around a 50% reduction in the fees that the residents have to pay, which I think is a very clear indication of both the necessity of reform and the difficulties that some face in achieving it. Madam Deputy Speaker, I realise time is pressing, so I will just try to pull together several other case studies in and around Reading Town Centre and indeed in other parts of our town. These relate to failures by Firstport, Moorland Estates and other management companies. And they include issues like allowing antisocial behaviour to take place in stairwells, leaving residents intimidated, poor response to fire remediation some years after the Grenfell disaster, and a series of other difficult problems. Again and again, residents being put under pressure. And in one case, a resident used the 1985 Landlord and Tenant Act, quite rightly, to demand a breakdown of the payments they were due to be charged, only for the managing agent not to respond to the statutory deadline. That is the level of poor service that some of my residents and other colleagues' residents are facing, Madam Deputy Speaker. So I would urge the Minister to continue with the important action on this matter. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I just want to firstly congratulate my honourable friend, the Chair of the Select Committee, for securing this important debate. The issues raised in her committee's recent report speak strongly to the experiences of thousands of my constituents in Poplar and Limehouse, where we have the highest percentage of leaseholds as a number of homes in any constituency in the country. Like many members of the committee, I'm not just alarmed, I'm in fact very angry about what many constituents have to go through in order to get even basic repairs and maintenance done. Far too many of them have to deal with uncommunicative, sometimes even rude or dismissive managing agents who can offer no clarity on maintenance works and delay necessary repairs again and again. And just to illustrate this, using a recent example, in the heat waves, constituents living in Royal Captain Court in my constituency have endured the most horrible of conditions, with the lifts forced into fire safety mode because of the extreme heat in the unconditioned tower. One resident fainted in the staircase and dozens of others suffered in the temperatures. Residents have said that until the BBC reported on the case, that they received no replies from the managing agent Sanctuary about how, when or if repairs will even be done. This is a common situation in my constituency, Madam Deputy Speaker, the issue of lift breakdowns, and the issue will only occur more and more against the backdrop of the climate change intensifying. On top of this, Madam Deputy Speaker, as we all know, service charges and fees are going through the roof. One constituent recently contacted me to say that they have seen service charges rise 12% in the last year, after they'd already doubled in the decade up to that point. Residents of Aberfieldy Village in my constituency are reporting to me that service charges increased of £600,000 by Firstport, and residents of Wapping Lane development report to me that their service charges increased from £7,000 in 2014 to £17,000 this year by Ballymore. Now, across the board, these residents and constituents tell me that they're receiving no transparency about the accounts, and we know that they cannot easily or fairly challenge these increases in court. The government have been consulting on the implementation of the Section 56 of the 2024 Act, provisions around service charge transparency, which many of my constituents need to see implemented swiftly, but the regulation of managing agents themselves must be brought forward. I cannot simply accept the massive discrepancies in costs, the service charge increases, the lack of communications and the lack of basic decency. In Poplar and Limehouse, many of the leasehold bills we have are huge. They are incredibly tall, over 20 floors in many cases, and that would make it very difficult for leaseholders to take over and run themselves their buildings under right to manage, a system that itself needs desperately simplifying. So there are some changes that are being brought forward in the leasehold bill, but for thousands in my constituency, they will continue to suffer under runaway service charges and rogue managing agents. And in absence of abolishing leasehold, I think it's only right, therefore, that the government accepts the recommendations of the Housing Committee and Lord Best and introduces an independent regulator for managing agents into the leasehold reform bill. And today I urge the government to do so.
Via Blake.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Firstly, I should declare an interest as a leasehold homeowner, which is very common in Sheffield, and I would like to thank my friend, the Honourable Member for Vauxhall and Camberwell Green, for securing this important debate, and I agree wholeheartedly with the recommendations by her committee and Lord Best around a regulator.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome it that this government has begun to take a deep look at the injustices embedded in the leasehold system. This structure treats leaseholders not as full homeowners but as a revenue stream for distant freeholders and managing agents. The draft Commonhold and Leasehold Reform Bill is an important step forward to correcting the imbalance, and I believe it will help address many of the structural problems that leaseholders have endured. In my constituency, the consequences of this system are painfully clear, as has been mentioned by my constituency neighbour. My constituents have been experiencing not only threats of forfeiture, but being asked to pay thousands of pounds for their leaseholds for minor breaches of their leases. The ability of the freeholder to strip someone of their home is an extraordinary concentration of power, and I'm pleased that the government's Commonhold and Leasehold Reform Bill proposes to abolish forfeiture entirely. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, abolishing forfeiture alone does not resolve the fundamental injustice. Leaseholders remain trapped in a system that at its core is a feudal relic, a structure designed not to empower people but to extract value from them. It is a system where people who have bought homes still find themselves paying escalating service charges, opaque administration fees and arbitrary costs imposed by freeholders. A significant number of my constituents own leasehold houses where their leases require them to ask permission from their freeholders for things like loft conversions, extensions, and even for selling their homes on. These permissions are demanded in return for ground rents of little worth, often £10 a year, yet they give freeholders extraordinary control over the life of these leaseholders. This is not a fair housing system, and my constituents have a clear ask from me, which is that they have rightly suggested that leaseholders of houses should be given the statutory right for first refusal when their leaseholds are sold. At present, leaseholders do not have this right, while flats do. If a freeholder decides to sell the freehold of a house, the leaseholder has no guaranteed opportunity to buy it. They may only learn of the sale once it has occurred several months later. If we are serious about empowering leaseholders, then first right of refusal must be extended and it should be included in the bill. It isn't just freeholders who cause problems. We've heard about managing agents subjecting many residents to problems, including in my own constituency, where leaseholders were made to fine £22,000 within 5 months for major works. This was following an inept management company leaving balconies and walls to crumble and the eventual repairs to become more expensive. Now a 2-bedroom flat on that estate advertised for sale with an annual service charge of £5,067, that's £422 a month, which in Sheffield is a staggering amount of money given our relatively low housing costs. Unsurprisingly, some of my constituents have struggled to sell their flats and they're trapped in that catch-22 that we've heard from others, and it is time that we end that, and we need to make sure that we have all the powers enacted in this bill, but we also should be looking at ways to make sure that this is future-proofed as well, and I think that the regulator really does root that in fairness. So thank you.
Jonathan Brash.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. From the moment I was elected in Hartlepool, my inbox, my surgeries, my public meetings have been filled with people telling me remarkably similar and shocking stories about their estate management companies, on which I wish to focus my remarks. The tale is very similar. Terrible communication, risible explanations, no accountability, but ever-rising bills. I asked my constituents ahead of this debate to send me examples, and I was overwhelmed by the sheer number that I received, and so obviously I cannot go through them all today. The stories came from Marine Point, Long Branch Estate, Wynyard Mews, St Mary's Court, and other estates across the town. One of my constituents, Andrew, highlighted the fundamental unfairness between estates adopted by the council and those left in private management. People can live just streets apart, pay the same council tax, yet receive completely different levels of service. Derek asked me a simple question: why should we pay both Hartlepool Borough Council and Cellar Management when the council cannot carry out the work because it's not adopted the estate and the management company appears unwilling to carry it out either. It is an entirely fair question. Take Ray and Janice. They wish to put their property into a living trust, a property they own outright, yet they were delayed from doing so because seller management must first consent. They describe this as medieval behaviour. Jordan told me he was threatened over alleged unpaid invoices that he never received. The first meaningful communication was not an explanation, it was a demand. That is no way to treat people. Helena was told when she bought her Long Branch home that as more families move on to the estate, costs would fall because they would be shared more widely. The number of households has more than doubled. Her charges have not fallen, they have risen by more than £200. Kim described waiting months for basic repairs, only for residents to feel that the work that was eventually carried out was of poor quality. Others have shown me photographs of unfinished drains, damaged curbs, maintenance left incomplete. These are not legal technicalities, they are the everyday experiences of ordinary families. People paying real money for work they cannot see, cannot verify, and simply do not believe has been carried out properly. My constituent Christine, whose property is managed by Kingston, told me residents were collectively charged around £24,000 to repaint a block of flats on the headland. Within 3 months, the paint was already peeling. Residents
Order! Due to a fire evacuation of the palace, the sergeant on duty is